When we think about the domain eukarya, eukaryotic cells, it includes all of multicellular life. We tend to think of two main kingdoms, and that would be animals and plants. And we've already talked a lot about animals, and we're going to talk about plants here coming up. But there's a whole other kingdom that we often forget about, and that is the kingdom of fungi. And the most famous fungi are mushrooms, but mushrooms are really just the fruiting body, essentially. They're the reproductive structure. And the vast majority of the tissue of fungus is underground. It is these sets of filaments that create a huge amount of surface area underground and absorb nutrients from the soil, secrete enzymes to break down organic material and sometimes inorganic material. And a lot of them have mutualistic relationships with trees and other plants on the forest floor, where they provide minerals and help absorb water from the soil and in return receive sugars. Here you can see a few examples of mushrooms sticking up from the forest floor here, or a log, but inside this log or underneath the soil in the forest floor, there are lots and lots of filaments. All fungus, like animals, are heterotrophs. They all have to absorb nutrients from outside their bodies, but unlike many animals which will ingest food, fungi secrete enzymes which break down a lot of different compounds into smaller organic compounds that can be absorbed. And they have a lot of different enzymes, so they can live in a lot of different areas and eat a lot of different things. There are three primary examples of ecological lifestyles that fungi will exhibit: decomposers, parasites, and mutualists. Decomposers break down and absorb nutrients from non-living organic materials. So an animal or a plant dies, a tree falls over, leaves in the fall come down and rest upon the forest floor. A lot of that gets broken down by fungus, right? The strawberry at the bottom of the bin that you've had for a couple of weeks in the back of your fridge. Those are decomposers, and they're very, very important ecologically. Parasites absorb nutrients from living hosts. You can think about like the athlete's foot that you may or may not have. Shh, it's okay. You don't need to tell us. And mutualistic fungi absorb nutrients from hosts and then reciprocate with actions that benefit the host. So in other words, if you think of lichens are an algae and a fungus that mutualistically work together. The fungus is able to break down rock and bring in minerals, and the algae can then photosynthesize, take up those minerals, but return some sugars to the fungus. Similarly, we'll talk a lot about mycorrhizal fungi, which live on roots of almost all plants out in the forested ecosystem, and will help them bring in water and nutrients and move nutrients between individual plants, and in return receive sugars from those plants. Most fungi, like plants and animals, are multicellular, but there are single-celled fungi, like yeasts. And we use yeasts for a lot of things. They're very important for making bread and wine and beer and things like that. A lot of species can do both. They can either be single-celled or they can grow into multicellular filaments. But the majority are going to be multicellular filaments, and some of those will grow mushroom fruiting bodies. Most fungus produce these filamentous hyphae, and these hyphae are long, very thin filaments that again have an extremely large amount of surface area for contacting organic and inorganic material around them to break it down and to absorb those nutrients into the cells that form the hyphae. And here you can see actual pictures of this white stuff that's kind of around old wood or leaf litter. You can find this stuff in the top layer of the soil if you walk outside your house and kind of put your hand down and dig it up a little bit. And then the hyphae are also what form this fruiting body or reproductive structure in the mushroom, but at the end they produce spores. They have structures that produce spores which will spread out and grow into new mushrooms. The hyphae have cells that have cell walls. So like plants, unlike animals, Fungi have cell walls, but the cell walls are very different from those of plants. Instead of being made of cellulose, they're made of chitin. And yes, chitin is the same carbohydrate that makes the exoskeletons of arthropods. Mats of these hyphae, so big networks of these filamentous hyphae, are called mycelium. Whenever you see MYC or myco, that refers to fungus. So someone who studies fungus is called a mycologist. Most hyphae are separated into different cells by these septa, septum singular, septa plural, but the septa have pores in the middle that allow movement of cellular materials, even to the point of organelles, to move from cell to cell. Cenocytic hyphae don't have septa at all, right? They're essentially like a syncytium. So they have nuclei that mark where different cells would be, but they're all sort of together. And hyphae are specialized depending on what sort of feeding you do. If you feed on live animals, right, you'll have hyphae specialized for that. If you feed on live plants, you will have specialized hyphae called haustoria for that. And some mutualistic fungi have arbuscules, which are these branching hyphae that allow for exchange of nutrients with their plant hosts. So here you can see these specialized hyphae called arbuscules that literally enter the plant and allow for exchange of materials with the plant cell, whereas up here are specialized hyphae for trapping and killing prey. These are fungi that actually hunt and kill, in this case, nematodes. Mutualistic associations of plant roots and fungus, mycelium from fungus, are called mycorrhizae. And you have certain mycorrhizal fungi that form these arbuscules. These are called arbuscular mycorrhizae. Those have those extended hyphae that go through the cell wall to allow for exchange. But there are other mycorrhizal fungi that don't form those arbuscules. They form sheaths over the root, and we call these ectomycorrhizal fungi. Ecto meaning on the outside. Mycorrhizal fungi are beneficial to plants because they help deliver minerals like phosphates to plants, and also they expand the surface area for plants to absorb things like water in addition to minerals, because these mats of hyphae have incredible surface area to volume ratios. The majority of plants have mycorrhizae, and then those fungi will disperse themselves like other fungus using spores. Fungus can reproduce either sexually or asexually. So you start with your mycelium, which is your network of hyphae, and sometimes just from those mycelia you can make spore-producing structures, and these are all haploid. So we're in a haploid stage for the vast majority of the fungal life cycle, unlike animals and most plants. But we produce haploid spores, which then disperse either via wind or water or any number of ways, and then they land and they grow and germinate into another mat of mycelium, and maybe into another spore-producing structure, again, like a mushroom or something. But they can reproduce sexually too. So these haploid mycelia may find another mycelium, another fungus, and fuse the cytoplasms into a single cell with two different nuclei, but the nuclei haven't come together yet. So in this case, we've got a cell with two different nuclei from two different organisms, but the nuclei haven't fused yet. So we're heterokaryotic, which means multiple nuclei. So in this case, we're kind of somewhere in between haploid and diploid. In the cell, you have two sets of genes, but in the nuclei, each nucleus only has one set of genes, one set of chromosomes, I should say. Then those nuclei fuse in a process called karyogamy. So this is a fusion of the nucleus. And now, very briefly, we have a diploid zygote, just like you would in plants or animals. But that diploid zygote is very quickly going to undergo meiosis, and we don't spend long diploid. We're going to produce haploid spores, which are then going to get dispersed, again, via wind or water, depending on the fungus. They're then going to germinate and create mycelium. So you have asexual or sexual modes of reproduction, but even in the sexual mode of reproduction, there's only a very short diploid stage. which is kind of the opposite of animals. If you think about it, animals have a haploid stage. It's gametes, right? It's when we make sperm or eggs via meiosis. But very quickly, those sperm or eggs are going to join together in fertilization to form a diploid zygote. And then that diploid zygote is what multiplies via mitosis to produce us. So we think of mitosis as producing diploid daughter cells, but really mitosis produces genetically identical daughter cells to the cells you already had. So when we go from a single-celled spore to germinate and make a mycelium, it's mitosis that is making these single-end spores turn into these multicellular structures. Similarly, if we have single cell spores here, which are haploid, they will undergo mitosis to form multicellular structures, right? Meiosis is only here to turn the two-end zygote briefly in existence to one-end spores. Just like other sexually reproducing organisms, they have to find mates somehow, and they can't do it, acoustically or visually like we do. So they use pheromones. They use chemical communication to find another organism that is a compatible mating type. So sometimes there are not male and female necessarily, but different mating types of particular species of fungi that have to be compatible to one another in order to fuse. Again, this fusion is called plasmogamy, and it results in a heterokaryote, which means an individual with multiple nuclei in the same cell from different sources. Usually that is dikaryotic, meaning two different sources of nuclei that have yet to fuse. When they fuse, it's called karyogamy. The nuclei come together. We briefly have a diploid phase, which will undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. As we mentioned earlier, in addition to sexual reproduction, many fungi can reproduce sexually. Molds tend to do this. They just produce spores via mitosis, which then form visible mycelia. So here's an example of essentially the fruiting body or the spore-producing body of mold. This is happening asexually via simply mitosis. Single-celled fungi also reproduce asexually. So yeasts, which are single-celled fungi, just have cell division. But it sort of looks like a budding. So you have a new bud cell growing off and pinching off of a parent cell. Other fungi can grow as yeasts or filamentous mycelia. Here's a look at what's going on. If you look very, very closely into your beer this weekend, you can see buds coming right off of parent cells in those growing yeast. Fungi may seem to act more like plants in that they are stationary, they don't move around, and they have cell walls. But again, those cell walls are very different from plants and evolved independently. And it seems pretty clear that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And the ancestor of modern fungi was probably a single-celled flagellated aquatic protist. In fact, fungi and animals all are part of a protistan clade that you may remember from Bio 131 called epistoconts. And all epistoconts evolved, we think, from a single-celled flagellated ancestor. So we have our unicellular flagellated ancestor of all epistoconts, and branching off quickly are animals and other protistan relatives kind of like us. And then we move towards nuclearids, which are sort of a type of amoeba, and then fungi, all in our same group. And because fungi are more closely related to these nuclearids, that means that multicellularity probably arose separately. It evolved twice in animals and in fungus, or once in animals, once in fungus. So it's not like animals and fungus had a multicellular ancestor and it evolved once, and that arose into two separate kingdoms. It arose separately in each kingdom as we were evolving. And while fungi, like the rest of us, originated in the water, they were among the earliest colonizers of land, and of the earliest plants to colonize land. There's relationship that very early on there were mutualistic relationships forming in terms of mycorrhizal fungi between early land plants and early land fungus.